Welcome to the Goot Reaction. I'm your host, Joe Goot, and with me as always is my main man from the Midwest. Today we're going to be talking about things that are backwards. We're going to drop some examples. We have some interesting anecdotes to share, but basically just things around the world that are not what they should be. We're going to kind of dive in with our first example here and see where it takes us. So when you think about the American healthcare system, it spends more than any developed nation, but has worse outcomes. There's more medical debt in this country, more bankruptcies from medical debt. And when you think about it too, just as often there are delays as there is sometimes in socialized medicine. So that's kind of our baseline. We think we have the best system. We have healthcares, we have PMBs, we have all these middlemen with the pharmaceutical industry. Everyone wants their piece. Everyone wants to wet their beak. But I was listening to this lecture from Manly P. Hall the other day, and this was back in the early 80s, I believe. And one of the things that he was talking about was that with Chinese medicine, so maybe other Eastern cultures and societies as well, but with Chinese medicine, you actually pay your doctor to keep you healthy, and you don't have to pay if you get sick. So it's kind of one of those backwards things that got me thinking that is a brilliant model. The incentives are there to not, as in our system, to just treat symptoms for the most part and just throw drugs at you. And again, I'm not totally bashing that in terms of pharmaceuticals. I'm a believer in better living through chemistry. So I've taken advantage of a lot of medicines over my life, and they have done wonders for me. They've also not always worked, but that being said, with the Chinese system, it just makes a lot of sense. The incentives are there to keep you healthy and to do proactive preventive medicine. And I think that's, we have some shift towards that. You see a lot of benefits that companies offer here in the States, to try to get you to exercise, to try to get you, your mental health, like services like BetterHelp, for example, other things where they provide these things to try to get you some of those preventive or maintenance things, I think, that are really good to see. But I think in general, just the incentive system is backwards in this country. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that and see if you agree.
Yeah, well, it sort of, seems like what you're talking about is, you hear our healthcare system referred to as a sick care system more often than not. You go to the doctor when you're not feeling good. You get prescribed some, pharmaceutical regimen typically. And I echo your statements about, there's definitely some good medicines out there, some good things, but I think our system tends to abuse them a little bit, kind of want to keep you on stuff so that the pharmaceutical companies keep making their money off that. Yeah, but I think you're right. And I think too about like when I know people who they get injured, they maybe have a knee problem. I know someone who tore their ACL recently, and the first thing, there's a whole process you have to go through where they won't pay for an MRI first. The insurance companies won't pay for an MRI first. Right, you have to go to physical therapy first. So you have an injured knee, which highly suspected it's injured, something torn. So you got to go to, and I know physical therapists are really good. They'll kind of evaluate it and they'll do some things, but you got to try to work with that injured knee first. And then if that doesn't work, then they'll perhaps pay for the MRI with the intention of getting you to surgery. You know what I mean? So it's all this funnel of things, but you don't really get to decide unless you want to pay out of pocket. So I guess I kind of digress from your question there a little bit, but the matter of the paying for someone to keep you healthy versus paying to treat your illness, it really is a very interesting concept. I did listen to a little bit of that myself, and it said you hire them, they kind of do an evaluation, and they're literally, they kind of work with you. You're a partner in this, and their job is to keep you healthy. And if something happens and it doesn't work, then they don't get paid. It's a crazy, it's a crazy good idea. But I'd be curious to know who all the players are in that system. It's being that it's a communist government, I would have to assume it's a state-run, system. There's probably not insurance companies involved. There's probably not large healthcare providers, large hospital systems involved, but I really don't know. But I'd be
Mhm.
curious to know the answer to that. Have you done any more research or anything to see what the situation is there?
Yeah, I think to that point, it's a much more holistic endeavor. And I think Manly Hall also mentioned some things. I believe he was talking about Taoism and how philosophy and that kind of way of life and that way of thinking and being is a big part of that, which is trying to seek balance, trying to, not overindulge. So it's kind of a cultural way of life paired with then holistic preventive medicine, which those two things together I think is the key to it. So that makes me think of, for example, here in Portland, they tried to use the Portugal model to decriminalize drugs and to treat, repeat users and people that were addicted and divert from the criminal justice system into treatment system. And it failed spectacularly. And so they decriminalized basically personal quantities of all drugs. And it took about 2 years, year and a half, 2 years, and they just recriminalized everything because you had people cooking fentanyl on the streets, shooting heroin on the sidewalks, needles everywhere. It was just a disaster because what they didn't have was the essentially Medicare for all. They didn't have the mandatory treatment. They had a voluntary treatment. And so after thousands of police encounters and court encounters, maybe less than 100 people actually called these numbers and then got some sort of treatment instead of just walking away with a fine or, jail and release kind of thing. So that kind of makes me think of sort of that half measures thing where unless you have the entire system in place or something like it, then you're likely going to fail. So I think if we were going to try something like that here, it's not just about the shift in payment model, for example, where you say we're going to pay to keep you healthy, we're not going to pay if we get sick, kind of thing. We also have to have that shift in mentality and just overall kind of culture.
Yeah, that's interesting. You brought up the drug situation in Portland because I had that written down too, and I was going to go there too. Yeah, you can't only do part of it. You mentioned the Medicare for all and some of the treatment centers and or treatment approaches, and yeah, what I remember reading about, it might have been Portugal, it might also have been, I think Finland does something
Mm,
like this too. A lot of the Scandinavian countries is they decriminalize the drug. In some cases, they even like make it available to you, and they say when you need to get your fix, you come to this center and you get your fix and you're in a safe environment. And then, oh, by the way, we're going to help you try to deal with that and also make sure you're working and you're, trying to go on about having a fairly, you know, stable life on top of that. And ideally, eventually help you wean off of that, not just say, oh, here go all the drugs you want. They're no longer legal. Have at it. You know what I mean? And then
yeah,
not back that up with the other side. So yeah, I'm glad you brought up that point.
yeah.
On the other thing what was the thing you said after that?
The kind of the mentality and the cultural mindset
Oh
of
yeah,
like
yeah,
Taoism versus just Western
yeah,
cultural capitalism and
yeah.
excesses and things like that.
Well, I was thinking about that too when you mentioned the cultural changes. It will have to go to. I mean, that'll have to trickle up, right? It's not just what
Hmm.
medical services are available to you. It's got to go to food. It's got to go to honestly, it's got to go to environmental protections. It's got to go
Yeah.
to things like that other health factors in the society, not just the medical aspect of it. I remember I was listening to something today where they were talking about how Trump wants to, you know, he got asked a question about food prices, and he said the way he was going to tackle that was to limit the importation of cheap stuff from other places to help our farmers and to this, it was this roundabout, crazy answer. And he I think at one point referenced, oh, we're going to do like the other countries do. We're not going to let other food in. Well, and I may not have that 100% right as
Hmm.
far as a quote, but I think one thing he's missing there when he says other countries don't let their food in, it's like, yeah, Europe will not let a lot of our meat and things like that in because they won't let factory farm meat be sold over there. They won't let factory farm chickens and eggs from those chickens
with the
be sold over
antibiotics
there.
and all that
Yeah,
stuff.
exactly. They have much higher standards on their food quality. They have much more ability to stand up to the, maybe I don't know if the politicians aren't paid off quite as much over there or what, but they're able to stand up to the corporations more and say, no, you're not going to dictate what kind of food we eat. We're going to dictate what kind of food we eat. And I think that leads into what we're saying, just a better overall health system. There's less to treat then, there's less ailments, there's less obesity, there's less all kinds of other factors, which then add to the spiraling costs of healthcare. And when they talk about, well, socialized medicine, it'd be so expensive. It's like, yeah, but you got to, it's not just a socialized version of paying for all the things we have to pay for because of our poor health habits and our poor health culture. It's a better overall health environment, which then allows a healthcare system to be more sustainable, cheaper, more easily managed. So it all goes hand in hand.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a huge point. I mean, if there's a couple things that you said that kind of could lead into different topics, different examples that we have. And one is money and politics influence and how that impacts the regulatory state and our overall environmental quality. So lobbyists grease the wheels of politicians. Politicians turn around and pass laws that make it easier for businesses to pollute and make profits at a higher rate. And that impacts the people that live in those communities where those factories and farms and various things are. So that's one aspect. And then the other aspect was the food system, which also is backwards, where it's easy to get processed corn syrup laced, just crazy unhealthy products that are easy to make, cheap to make, and taste good, loaded with sugar and fat, and that we want to eat but isn't the best for us. And it's so much easier to get those cheap things and cheapen in terms of manufacture, the cost and the ingredients to manufacture them, versus the things that we really should be eating more of, which are healthier for us. And so you've got the food impact on our health, the environmental impact on our health, like you said, and that whole circle just keeps going and going. And then that feeds into then being sick, being overweight, etc. And then back to the healthcare system where, again, the culture that we have just kind of influences us and encourages us to just consume, consume, consume. And that goes for what we buy in terms of just products and services, but also what we eat and where we live and what we surround ourselves with. So it's all just like this unvirtuous cycle in this case. So, yeah, if you want to dive into the food aspect of that specifically, I know that was one example that I had as well, where again it's just we're overly saturated with these products that are not healthy for us but are cheaper and easier to get, versus in terms of like food deserts and in cities, a lot of cities areas where most places are more difficult to find healthy, fresh, and God forbid organic options, versus all the processed, prepackaged, frozen stuff, for example, that's so easy to get. And I think a lot of people just overlook that as part of their overall health. It's just something everyone needs to do, and but yet it comes down to money, what you can afford. It comes down to time, what you can dedicate to prep and cook. For example, if you have several kids and you're trying to think, oh my God, how am I going to spend the time? I get home from work, one or two jobs, and then you have to go through all this ritual of preparing food and trying to do right by your kids and your family. But yet you may be constrained by money, you may be constrained by time, your energy levels, which again is another cycle, right? If your energy levels are low, then you're going to eat lower quality processed foods that have less nutrients and less good things in them. And then surprise, surprise, you're low energy again the next day. So it's that just those crazy virtuous cycles or unvirtuous cycles in this case, that, kind of.
Yeah, you mentioned well, for one, I think that's why you're seeing those food prep services like HelloFresh, and a lot of those are getting to be, ever so popular. But
Yeah.
my biggest hesitation to starting to try some of those is the waste element. I mean,
Hmm.
I could be wrong, but I think every time you get a meal shipped to you, it's sent in some kind of container with, I believe, some kind of disposable um, cooling element or
Hmm.
something. Like there's a lot of, unless there's a process where they pick those things back up from you, which I would. It'd be nice if that was the case. Like here, kind of like the old
Would be
milkman,
nice,
right?
yeah.
Like put your stuff back out the next day for the guy to pick up and take back. And the only reason I
Yeah.
thought maybe that's even a thing is the one company is called Factor, and I see a
Mm.
van driving around every once in a while. That's a Factor van, and I'm like, oh, if they're actually delivering meals, then boy, it'd be nice if they were, like I said, picking stuff back up. Hey, we can reuse these freezer pack things again, so that people aren't just throwing them away every time. Thinking about the food production aspect too, like I remember hearing recently that like the vast majority of our produce in this country, I mean, obviously there's like oranges in Florida and different things around the area, but so much of it comes from the agricultural areas of like California and things like that. But yet we have all these farms across the Midwest that grow either corn or soybeans, and
Mhm.
it's not or grain. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But the corn is what you'd call more of a industrial is probably not the right word, but it's not sweet corn. You know what I mean? It's not corn you're going to consume. It's basically grain for cattle or to be used for like high fructose corn syrup and other things like
Mhm.
that. So high fructose corn syrup you already touched on is bad. The things I've read and seen said that cattle really aren't supposed to eat grain. They're
Right.
herbivores. They're supposed to eat plant. They're supposed to eat grass and stuff out in the pasture. So you're feeding them grain in these factory farm operations. So now they're potentially not the healthiest. You turn around and eating meat then from that. So, soybeans, let's go there for a second. Soybean oil used heavily in places, but not very healthy. So and this is not to disparage the farmers because I understand they're trying to make a living just like everybody else. But when they say, well, we grow your
Sure.
food, it's like, well, do you? Like, because I can't go out and eat that corn. I'm not just
Yeah.
going out and cooking up soybeans. It's going in other products, most of which are determined to be not all that good for you. So, are
Mhm.
you really growing our food? What if you grew tomatoes or something instead? I mean, I know it would be a whole different agricultural process, but I think then you could say you're growing our food.
Right.
Food that's good for
Right.
us anyway.
No, that's an interesting point for sure. I think that, yeah, that gets into, I think, what could be a much bigger discussion topic. I think one that we, should probably touch on at some point in a later episode. But, you think about how like mechanized farming has become with the large factory farms instead of local smaller operations. And I think just like any large scale operation, they're looking for efficiency, they're looking for cost cutting, they're looking to just get the most product out at the cheapest possible cost. And so I think when you look at the products that they're making or the products that they're farming and then how they produce them, the machinery they make, or they use, the amount of labor they have to hire, whether it's migrant labor or local labor. Either way, that's all decisions that they have to make. And when you can just do rows of corn and throw a combine at it and use GPS and you're boom boom boom, you're done. Not to overstate or undervalue the effort involved, but compared to like you were saying, where if there was a variety of crops and you had to pay people to hand pick them. You couldn't just throw a machine at it and go up and down the rows. That's all part of the calculation that they're making, and it's unfortunate because I do think we, as a country, could use more of those healthy fruits and vegetables that could be farmed. And then also, this is something I know when you and I talk separately a lot. You always talk about the value of rotating crops and basically paying attention to the land and how it would be behaving on its own and giving it as little extra treatment or extra effort as possible and just kind of trying to be as natural as you can and respecting the land. And then it's going to churn out much better product at the end of the day. So if you did start to see more farming operations, then that would give you the ability to do all those kinds of things and still, as you're rotating, as you're laying some fields fallow, et cetera, you could still produce a lot of varied crops at any given season. So I think the opportunity is there. It's just a shift in mindset, which is again another example of how things are backwards.
Yeah, and part of the problem there too, and then we can jump onto one of those other ideas
Mm-hmm.
is farms have to operate at such scale in order to be able to afford the equipment that makes it easier to do the work, right? So your big, massive GPS combines, like you're talking about, where you have to be able to grow so many acres in order to sell enough product to be able to afford that sort of machinery, and that I've heard from a lot of different places is what's driving the small farms out of business, or
Mm-hmm.
making them get bought up by the larger farms for their land, because they can't operate at the same efficiencies. Like, you need scale to be able to afford the equipment that makes it more efficient. Otherwise, when you're operating on a small scale, you have to do the same kinds of things. You don't have near as nice equipment, so you're operating much less efficiently because you're small. So
Yeah.
that's kind of that's sort of a backwards
Mhm.
model, I think, that's driving some of the problems. But
Yeah,
um,
agreed.
yeah. What was another example you had of your list of backwards things?
I think, well, this one's a good one, but it's a little bit of a shift from what we've been talking about so far. But I think it's just taxes in general. So just the concept of taxes that are at a higher rate for income, which for the average person, let's say even upper middle class on down, obviously through working class and lower income folks, you're being charged a percentage of your income. Now, granted, there's marginal. It's marginal. So, the more you make, the more you pay, which makes sense, I think. But the fact that your average person's income taxes are higher than investment taxes is completely backwards, in my opinion. I think we could change the system and simply flip it. Make taxes on, let's start with the kind of the highest thing, like for companies when they do stock buybacks, make them pay a tax on that. When you as an average person get dividends or you get capital gains from selling an investment, make the tax on that higher, because in most cases that money is extra money. A lot of people can't even invest in the stock market. I think it's something like, maybe 50% or less just can't. They don't have the cash to do it. They have a 401k maybe, or they have a basic IRA or something that, allows them to save for for their retirement and so forth. But the tax on investments should be much higher than the tax on actual hardworking people's income. And I think that would be an interesting model to look at. I'm sure there's some studies out there I didn't get a chance to look into, if there's been, some think tanks that have looked into that. But I would have to think that somewhere somebody has looked at that option. But I just think in general it's a much more ethical and moral system than taxing people's extra money, millionaires and billionaires potentially, their money at a lower rate and average hardworking person's income at a higher rate. I think that's completely backwards.
Yeah. So maybe this is a different way to think about that, but like, okay, so you and I go out every day and we use our skills and our intelligence and our labor to make an income. We're using the tools we have at our disposal to be able to do that. So if you've been fortunate enough to make enough money, like you said, you're in that 50% that can. I thought of the word, play in the stock market beyond like your 401k. Then that's another tool you have to try to make money, to make income. Ideally, they are making income off of that. So why is that income not taxed the same as how anybody else would go out and earn income? It's because they slide it into this other category of investments that then they want to call it something else, but they're still ideally making income off of it. So why isn't
Hmm.
it taxed like all income? It's just another tool they have at their disposal, but they're still just trying to make income. So if we think about
Yeah.
it the same, then we could tax it the same from a taxation standpoint. Though I think about too, like you hear about back in the 70s and 60s when the highest tax rate was something like 70%, and people would scoff at that today. When you hear people who've studied it talk about it, and they say, well, what that, because there was so much less income to be made once you'd reach a certain, how do I want to say that? Once you've reached a certain amount of income, you couldn't just go do these things like put it in investments and sort of tuck it away so that it's not getting touched. There was much more incentive for the business owners and the upper class to reinvest that money back into their businesses, which then helped workers. Maybe they expanded their business, they hired more people, so more jobs, so more people had a chance to make a good income and a good living. But now we make it so that basically once you hit a certain point, while it is marginal, like you said, it goes up. But once you hit a certain point, it's sort of like, well, it's not evenly, like it's not proportionally taxed, to,
Hmm.
so I don't know. I kind of jumbled that up a little bit, but what I'm trying to say is, if you, in the same light, if you taxed higher levels more, you could put that would come back into the economy and it would spread out much more evenly and help a lot more people. But you go back to
Yeah.
your lobbyists and your influence and money and politics stuff, and who's been lobbying to have those rules set the way they are. The people with the
Yeah, who can afford the lobbyists? Yeah. No, I mean that's actually a great segue, because I think another example that's pretty pervasive and unfortunate right now is money in politics and the influence of the rich, and essentially getting what they want, which is definitely in opposition to what the average person wants. But really, when you look at it, then it's the influence and the needs of the few versus the many. And I think that's completely backwards, because when you look at the average bill that gets passed, the average hearing that happens in Congress, for example, they're really at the heart of it. It's either about one, unfortunately, pure politics, sometimes pure theater, but also, especially when it comes to legislation, a lot of these legislators, then they essentially have their staff has these bills written for them by the lobbyists, by the industry groups, by the trade groups, that just slide this stuff in there, and then sometimes it doesn't even get changed at all. It's just, this is what we want. We just gave you $50,000 for your campaign, so we would love you to bring this bill to the floor. And who's it benefiting? Of course, it's benefiting them, not the people that live in the communities where their operations are, not the consumers of those products, not the taxpayers, not the federal treasury or anything. I think also, if you look, I can't remember the exact percentage, but I think it's something pretty close to 80-20 in terms of the bills that are popular, or the issues that are popular amongst, let's just say, round number, 80% of people across this country are not getting addressed through legislation. But the issues that are the 20% that are really popular for the billionaire class and the corporations, those are the ones that are getting passed, because they're the ones that are greasing the wheels. They're the ones that have the money and the influence in Washington. And so therefore they're the ones that are getting what they want. And I think that's completely backwards, and it has to change. And I mean, we could, again, this is another one of those topics that we could spend an entire episode talking about. But going back to the Powell memo, post Nixon years, and paving the way for the Supreme Court that we have now, and then even in between then with Reagan, kind of going after unions and really passing a lot of anti-consumer legislation. We just see this slide towards corporate rule. And so I think we're getting pretty close, if we haven't already been for a while, a capitalistic democracy instead of a democratic capitalist society. I think it's the other way around, that we're primarily driven by capitalism first, democracy second, and that's a big shame.
Yeah, so I mean, what you're calling out is backwards. There is the representatives not representing the people, right? Representing the
Hmm.
the the money. Doesn't the reversal of the Chevron doctrine play into that a bit too? Because doesn't that neuter the agencies in terms of being able to establish precedent. So, like where the EPA may want to establish rules that corporations have to follow, then doesn't that mean they can't, agencies like that would be potentially theoretically be trying to work on behalf of the people maybe no longer have the power to do so, and it goes back to Congress, who's getting paid.
Yeah, primarily goes to the courts
Oh, okay.
to decide. So, or to Congress to specifically legislate a very narrow uh, rulings that would then essentially probably go in front of the courts again as well. So basically, yeah, in both cases, you're relying on non-experts who are either elected or politically appointed decide on what should be again the domain of experts that are in these agencies, these longtime public servants that have dedicated their time, their careers to trying to do the right thing, trying to keep people safe or keep products safe or do whatever it is they do. But from the EPA to federal housing to Bureau of Land Management, all these things, yeah, are now basically it's up to the courts to say, yeah, we feel like this makes sense rather than the experts in those agencies.
The courts who, let's see, Clarence Thomas is bought and paid for. Samuel
Alito's not far
Alito.
behind. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I even saw something today or yesterday about that Eileen Cannon, who's ruled in favor of Trump in the Florida documents case. She has attended some very high profile like seminars or something that are put on by some right wing.
The Federalist Society, maybe.
It wasn't them. It was
Oh,
like
okay.
the George Mason Law School or something. But it's
Mm.
like the Clarence or no, it's the what's the guy who died? Antonin Scalia Law School or something. So that it's all very much in the same vein. So it's like, yeah. So now where maybe the agencies, I mean, I'm sure there was some shenanigans going on there, but where it was maybe they were a little harder to get to. Let's bring it back to the courts, who ultimately the really powerful people are right where they need to be in terms of the rich and powerful. That's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very unfortunate. I mean, it's basically just out and out corruption, and there used to be checks and balances against that. And not that it didn't happen before ever in politics or in business, not naive in that way, but now it's just so blatant and they just flaunt it. And there's really not a lot we can do about it. And I think really this particular issue gets at the heart of everything else because until you get money out of politics and you get corporations back to just being businesses, not being people that have money as free speech, you're not really going to fix anything else major because there is so much money behind all these other things, all these other concerns that people have that until you fix that, there's really no point in trying to address those things because so many politicians are just bought off and, they're not going to pass any legislation that offers meaningful change for the average person while they're getting all that money in the back door. So,
Yeah, and we should be clear, left and right, Democrats and
absolutely.
Republicans. Yeah.
Absolutely. The corporate
Um,
Democrats are just as guilty of that for sure. Yeah. Another thing, shift gears again a little bit. This is an interesting one to me. I think is also the idea of being safe as a society. We have in America. We have I don't know the latest number, but it's something like 400 million guns, roughly. So 1.25 guns for every person, man, woman, and child in this country, and we're the only major advanced country in this world that has the number of mass shootings that we do. We still have all the same mental health problems as other countries. We still have video games like every other country. We still have violent movies and TV shows. We have all the same outlying factors as many of these other countries do. But the biggest difference is that we have way more guns than almost any other place on the planet. And if not the most. And we have this culture of being just obsessed with and in love with guns and this concept that we're going to be safer. The more guns we have, the safer we're going to be. And I just think that's pretty backwards. And I think the numbers really tell the story there that as for example, in the 90s with the assault weapon ban passed and it lasted 10 years, we saw a decline in mass shootings, a decline in school shootings. Not all aspects of crime went down, for example, because they're not all related to that particular topic, but we did see some market improvement in the statistics that are related to having assault rifles involved. And then when that expired, we saw the numbers creep back up. And now we're in a place where the Supreme Court said bump stocks are fine. So basically, you can have effectively machine guns in the street. Missouri passed laws that said, yeah, if you're a high school kid, you can open carry an AR-15 in the middle of town. Just this concept of the more guns we have, the safer we're going to be. We should have guns in schools. We should have police officers, safety officers carrying guns, and more officers, more guns, as if that's going to really change the trajectory we're on, which is just being one of the most violent countries on the planet. The number one cause of death for youth in this country is firearms, and so nowhere else is like this. And so the fact that we're not safer with more guns is pretty telling, and I think is pretty backwards.
Yeah, there's always been talk. I'm thinking back to some of the school shootings and stuff that have happened in the last 10 years or so. And I remember there was a lot of conversation at one point about like, well, if there was somebody, well, this always comes up every time, right? If there was a good guy with a gun, they could have stopped the bad guy with a gun. And then they talk about, well, okay, but if you as a good guy pull out your gun and you're trying to take out the bad guy and the police show up, well, they don't necessarily know who was the shooter or not. So now you're standing there with a gun and you're just as likely to get taken out by the police as the actual shooter. So that doesn't sound all that safe. If you're in a crowded enough situation and everybody just starts shooting, you know what I mean? Like there was a case, I just saw a headline the other day that there was a shooter. Oh man, I'm going to butcher this, so I apologize. My facts won't be very good, but it was in like somewhere where there was like they said 4 people had gotten either injured or killed because someone had a gun and the cops tried to take the guy out and ended up hitting like 2 bystanders, another police officer, and the shooter. So, I mean, I don't know if that's really what we want either, but that was, at least the police. So you imagine the police are fairly highly trained. If you start having anybody with a gun start, pulling out and start shooting in a situation, you're going to have more casualties than you might have had initially.
Yeah.
I think it's sort of like hero complex that somebody's gonna pop in and save the day. And I'm not saying that's never happened because I've read stories about how somebody. It's usually someone that had maybe like a military background or a police background, was fairly trained. It wasn't just somebody who went and took a conceal and carry class and then started walking around with their gun. But yeah, it's definitely kind of a twisted idea that we think that more of the most harmful things will keep us safer. Yeah, it's definitely a twisted backwards idea.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there was something else I was thinking of there too. Well, the idea too that I've seen more and more stories pop up. I was listening to NPR the other morning and they were talking about a situation where, and I've heard this before about like the New York subway, that things might be happening and the cops don't necessarily step in, and then you find out that there's like in their rules or charter or whatever, it says something like basically they don't have to. Like they have the whole protect and serve mantra, and we always want to think, well, as long as there's a cop around, I'm going to be safe. It's like, well, if they decide to step in and intervene, if they decide it's either worth it or they're not going to put themselves too much at risk. And I couldn't help but think of that in the whole Uvalde situation, where the cops ultimately basically said, we're not going in. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We're not going into that. So that being said, that's even, to me, more reason why as a society we need to do something more about guns, because if we can't even rely on the people who we think are there to protect us, then that makes the idea of people walking around with guns even that much worse,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Because then we're walking around under a false pretense that now some people would argue, well, that's even more reason why I got to have a gun on me, because if the cops aren't going to protect me, then I got to be the one to step in and blow this dude away,
Yeah.
which then gets back to the whole situation I was talking about a few minutes ago.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
kind of a lose-lose situation.
Yeah. Absolutely. Any other examples that you wanted to bring up, or should we wrap it up?
No, I didn't really have too many others. I thought we talked about some good ones there, though, so
Okay.
I'm good.
Yeah, those are definitely some of the big ones that came to mind. And, I'm sure if we thought about it more, there are other things that are backwards in our society and culture. But yeah, I thought those are some good ones to touch on today. So thanks everyone for joining us and spending some time with us this week. And we will see you again next week on the Goop Reaction.